Welcome to today's event, Planning UN Peace Operations, Recent UN Reforms and Their Implications, co-hosted by IPI and the French Ministry of the Armed Forces. My name is Jake Sherman. I'm the Senior Director for Programs at IPI. Since taking office, the Secretary General has undertaken an ambitious set of reforms, a principal goal of which has been to increase the responsiveness and flexibility of United Nations field-based operations, including peace operations, to better prevent and end armed conflict. These changes, the creation of new departments, including the Joint Geographic Division shared by the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and the Department of Peace Operations, DPPA and DPO, and new procedures and ways of working have aimed to break down thematic and institutional silos. One of the intended benefits of the reforms is improved planning, design, adjustment, and transition of UN peace operations. Since the Secretary General's reforms were initiated in 2017, there have been 4 new peace operations in Colombia, in Hodeida, Yemen, in Haiti, and most recently in Sudan. Notably, all special political missions managed by DPPA, but all requiring system-wide analysis and expertise. Today's public virtual panel discussion, which launches the recent IPI policy paper by Marc Jacquand, UN Reform and Mission Planning, Two Great Expectations, will take stock of the various strands of UN reform and explore their impact on the planning of these and future UN missions. Before introducing our panel, let me first invite Brigadier General Roland Marguerite, the head of the Defense Mission at the Permanent Mission of France to the United Nations, to make opening remarks. General, over to you.
Thank you, Jack, for allowing me to say a few words. To begin, I would like to congratulate Marc Jacquand for his remarkable study, which is particularly stimulating. Allow me to start with broad views on planning. Planning is at an intermediate level between the strategic vision that sets the objectives, priorities, and general principles of actions, and the chain of command that must implement the lines of operation set by the planning. When the 3 points of the triangle are robust, by triangle I mean strategy, planning, and command, it offers considerable capabilities. A good strategic vision, an excellent plan, and a flexible, autonomous, and efficient chain of command are what all organizations need. To be relevant, the strategic vision must be adapted to the reality of the environment, clear in its definition of goals, and flexible. Downstream, the chain of command must be strong enough to enforce the planning process and must have the necessary freedom of action at the various levels to adapt to circumstances. Applying this general principle to peacekeeping operation immediately reveals the challenges involved. Clarity of purposes and strategic vision do not sit comfortably with the constructive ambiguity that characterizes some UN mandates. So, how do we resolve these difficulties in PKOs? For my part, I see 3 avenues, considering that attaining suddenly shared strategic goals between all stakeholders of PKO in transition is unrealistic. The first is at the headquarters level to give all senior UN managers a strong planning culture. Planning is not a subordinate function that can be delegated and disregarded. Planning is the art of the possible and the desirable. It teaches pragmatism, a sense of priorities, the optimal articulation of various actors, the courage to make choices, the uncompromising evaluation of the results obtained, and a sense of reality. All senior UN managers should, in my opinion, receive strategic training in New York and participate at least annually in a strategic planning exercise. Moreover, the Comprehensive Performance Assessment System, the CPAS, offers enormous possibilities that will force UN managers to get involved in planning. My second proposal is to increase the mobility between the different departments of the UN to foster a common culture. The UN system, as well as we all know, is complex, fragmented, and compartmentalized. Therefore, I believe that a reform of human resources is needed, with greater mobility between the different departments on the one hand and between headquarters and the mission on the other. The mobility will reinforce the culture of transversality and convergence of efforts. My final proposal concerns missions. It seems to me that the mission chief of staff must play a larger role in the integration of the various civilian, police, and military activities. He must be the real synchronizer of the mission, the one who coordinates the different means according to the head of mission orientations. This requires to strengthen his team and to give it a very solid competence in multi-sectoral planning. I thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, General. And two things that you raised, that cluster of issues around leadership and institutional culture, which Marc raises in the paper and that I hope will come up both in the panel discussion and when we turn to the Q&A, but I think maybe some issues there that would be worth diving a bit more deeply into. And this point about the role of the Chief of Staff, and I'll introduce the panel in a second, but I have a feeling we'll hear a bit more about that as well. So let me then turn to our panel. Our first speaker will be Marc Jacquand, an independent consultant with a long history of service inside the UN in various capacities, both at headquarters and in the field, who will provide an overview of the IPI paper. He'll be followed by Laura Flores, the director of the Americas Division in the joint regional structure of DPPA and DPO, where she has responsibility for both the mission in Haiti and the mission in Colombia. Next, joining us from Khartoum, Stephen Sikiera, the Chief of Staff ad interim of the UN Integrated Transition Mission in Sudan, UNITAMS, who previously led the UNITAMS mission planning process. We'll then hear from David Hyrie, Director of the Division of Policy, Evaluation and Training in the UN Department of Peace Operations, and then Ian Martin, former Special Representative of the Secretary General many times over, and a member of the high-level independent panel on peace operations. So Marc, let me give the floor to you to start us off.
Thanks, Jake, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Jake, and thanks to IPI for giving me the opportunity to do this piece of research and present it today. Thank you, Brigadier General Roland Marguerite. Merci pour vos remarques. And also, it's a pleasure to be here on this panel with Laura, David, Stephen, and Ian, with and for whom I've worked in different capacities over the last few years. Although I do have to say, Jake, there's a bit of a problem with the panel because all four contradict one of the conclusions of my paper, but I'll get back to that at the end. So you and I need to talk about that. So the paper takes a look at various elements of UN reform and the extent to which they've been able to improve the way missions are planned. And in the paper, when we talk about mission planning, we obviously talk about planning new missions, but also planning reconfigurations of existing missions. So that was the lens. Now, you probably all know that mission planning often comes under scrutiny and is a recurring theme in a number of reports over the last few years. Notably, the HIPPO report, Ian is much better equipped to speak to, but also we've seen it in recent reviews of the OECD on mission transitions, the way the UN plans these moments of transition and reconfiguration. Always comes up in those reviews, and you read the same things. The lack of coherence between the political strategy and the other mandates in a mission, or the lack of coherence between what the mission plans and the rest of the UN presence on the ground. A disconnect sometimes between the substantive planning and the mission support planning, and often the criticism is that the planning is supply driven. And just so when I was looking at UN reforms, I also want to, not all elements of UN reform are designed to improve mission planning. Some of them have nothing to do with mission planning, but many do, and many either directly or indirectly. And also just a few caveats, when the paper looks at UN reform, it looks at UN reform writ large. It's obviously the peace and security pillar, but also management reform, development reform, but also other initiatives that the Secretary General has launched or taken since coming to office in 2020 2017. So that's why the paper also looks at the establishment of the executive committee mechanism, the strategic reviews. We look at CPAS. We look at a number of things that have happened over the last few years and the impact on planning. Also, another caveat. When we talk about impact, usually people think long-term. And these reforms, some of them are just getting started, especially in terms of implementation. Some of them were just designed until last year and came into being this year. So it's also, I just want to make sure that the conclusions are taken for what they are. They're preliminary, they're stock taking, and they will need to be adjusted. And finally, also, obviously a very important caveat that a number of people that were consulted for this paper, member states or UN staff, referred to is the fact that there's only so much that the UN itself, the Secretariat, can do when it comes to mission planning. The outcome of a mission planning process depends partially on what the UN planning team puts together, but obviously the interests and the actions taken by member states play a large role, and that's inevitable given the nature of the UN. I mean, in a way, the big headline is because, as Jake said, I've been involved in mission planning for a while, and I think it was getting better before the reforms, and I think it's getting even better with and thanks to the reforms. There are obviously a few gaps and limitations that the paper speaks to, and I just wanted to highlight a few of those. And I was looking at impact from the perspective of analysis, whether the analysis is getting better, it's richer, it's broader, the extent to which the mission planning process now yields more options that are more tailored to context rather than supply driven or template driven. The extent to which also in the planning process, the UN is able to be consistent and cohesive when it comes to messaging to the council and to other member states. And then also whether the planning process comes now with fewer or lower transaction costs. So these were some of the metrics that were used, but as I looked at different parts of UN reform, other things came up that were interesting. So, and as Jake said, looking at it through the lens of what's happened in Haiti and Colombia, and full disclosure, I was involved as a staff member in different capacities in the planning of both, and also looking at the Yemen example and what's happening now in Sudan, which is a live case of planning. Very quickly, just to highlight a few elements of UN reform that I think are relevant. One, obviously, on the peace and security pillar, these joint geographic teams, the regional teams, are having an interesting impact on planning. One, because you now have a single point of entry, port of call for peace and security. And when it comes to planning, that's important. And it does mean greater, lower transaction costs for engagement in terms of planning, but also greater cohesiveness in terms of messaging and outreach to member states. Although that was not necessarily the case in the very early days of the Sudan, the UNITAM's planning, as some member states mentioned during the research. But what's really interesting is that you also now have, through these teams, I think a number of staff, it was interesting, told me that they really like the fact that their horizons have broadened. They don't just look at a peacekeeping mission, they can look at a special political mission. They have access to a much more diverse toolkit for planning missions that come in different sizes and shapes. And that I think that's an element that's really interesting, especially later when we talk about culture and UN identity. I think perhaps the paper does say explicitly that one of the gaps, one of the limitations is the fact that between the two departments, DPO and DPPA, you still don't have a joint planning capacity or unit. You don't also have shared tools, or there are tools like CPAS that stay separate. And I know people disagree. I know some people will argue that the two special political missions and peacekeeping operations are very different. The cultures are very different. I disagree. I do understand there are differences, notably in terms of budget, but I think that the emphasis on those differences speaks to other considerations. I think there is still an argument to be made for joint planning capacity and joint planning tools, or at least sharing of those tools. On the management side, what was interesting was to look at the impact that, for example, the delegation of authority has in allowing, especially when it comes to obviously existing missions, but allowing mission leadership with their planners to be much more flexible in shifting assets. And that goes to the core of what planning is aligning your means with your objectives and giving field colleagues the ability to do so in a much more responsive and flexible way. The paper also highlights a number of really important improvements made by the Department of Operational Support. When I was at the EOSG, I was really impressed by the ability to generate much more granular data on missions. And that really allows planning to be much more evidence-based, data informed, not data driven, but data informed at least. So I think, and also the department has the planning unit now that's dedicated to planning. And so you're seeing fewer gaps between mission support, the operational side of mission planning, and substantive side, thanks to those efforts. What was interesting was the development reform. You might think, what's that? What does it have to do with mission planning? But I remember when long time ago in Haiti, and in other places, the DPKO at the time, a little bit of frustration with the development side and its inability to step up to the plate, to be fragmented, and therefore undermine the overall mission planning process. And now I think with the development reform and having one resident coordinator much more empowered to bring the development actors together, you see in the most recent case of Haiti, a much better relationship between the peace and security pillar and the development pillar, and putting together mission plans that are more integrated. And so that's been it. And there are other aspects of development reform, notably the analysis that goes into development plans that looks at risks from a variety of perspectives that I think the peace and security pillar could really benefit from, to have much deeper and broader analysis to inform mission plans. And then, the paper looks at, oh, and finally, sorry, and one last point on development reform, which is also relevant for mission planning, is the imperative now, which I think is accelerated by the pandemic, to really rethink the presence of the entire UN configuration on the ground, not just missions. It's a difficult exercise, but the reconfiguration of UN country teams is something that I think the peace and security pillar should really be associated with in contexts where you have missions, because then it just amplifies the number of options in terms of capacities that you have to play with as a mission planner if on the other side the UN country team is going to be reconfigured. And then then the paper looks at one last bucket of reforms. I just want to emphasize here, just for the interest of time, the strategic reviews. So again, full transparency, when I was in the executive office of the Secretary General, we were asked to launch these reviews with DPO because it focused mostly on peacekeeping operations, not on special political missions. And I've seen them getting better each time because they are more data driven, because they become a bit more independent and they become a bit more transparent. But the paper certainly highlights still a number of potential improvements with these strategic reviews, notably perhaps looking at the ways in which member states can be involved in different ways, keeping in mind that they need to remain independent, so independent of pressures from within, but also independent from pressures coming from member states as well. I wanna end, Jake, with just a couple of thoughts, circling back to this issue of culture. But first, one of the concerns, though, is I saw a number of elements of UN reform that are relevant and that are starting to have an impact. I saw obviously a number of gaps, and I've mentioned a couple of those here. But one concern perhaps to be discussed here or with colleagues later on is the extent to which all of these different elements are coming together to have an impact that's just more than the sum of its parts. You have DPET working on CPAS, which I'm pretty clear in the paper, I think is a good tool and should be used much more broadly. You have a team in the UN that works on transitions. You have the very good work done by the Strategic Planning and Monitoring Unit in the Secretary General's office, notably when it comes to strategic reviews and the data work in collaboration with the Department of Operational Support. You have in DPPA, the Guidance and Learning Unit, that's also very much involved, doing a lot of support to special political missions. And one concern that emerges is whether all these very important initiatives, the extent to which they come together as one, and there's coherence to it. And actually, we can do much more out of all these different initiatives by linking them more closely together. And the second thought, and that's where I want to come back to the panel, is the report speaks at the end of, one obviously big part of UN reform that still is maybe the next frontier is human resources, because it speaks, when I looked at some of these hurdles, some of the challenges, some of the constraints, many of them, not all of them, but many of them boil down to cultural mindsets, and the fact that the way we approach planning in the UN, to some extent, and in some parts of the UN, is still driven or shaped by which department you belong to. And I think without, and I'm happy Brigadier General mentioned it, the mobility, because that's what the paper speaks to. Without many more people thinking beyond departmental identities, it's going to be difficult to have planning that meets these criteria of comprehensive analysis, tailored, context-driven, not beholden to departmental interests. And how you achieve that is obviously a major challenge. So the issue of mobility, make sure people have the opportunity to work on in one department, another one. And that's why I mentioned, I want to end with this, that the panel contradicts this, because I think all four belie what I just said. They're the exception. They're not the only ones in the UN system, but I think my fellow panelists are those who have this kind of broader one UN perspective, and when they've approached mission planning, it's been from that perspective rather than narrow departmental interest. But it is difficult. It's a cultural shift that needs to take place, and we know that this is the one aspect of the reform that takes more time than the formal, technocratic tools and systems that the reform has put in place. So it will take more time, but I think this is certainly something we need to keep talking about, because to go back to, I really like the expression that Brigadier General Marc mentioned, the courage to make choices. That's what it takes in mission planning. But in order to have the courage to do that, you need to sometimes extend beyond departmental interests and identities. Let me leave it at that. And thank you again, Jake and IPI, for organizing.
Thanks, Mark. That's really a fantastic overview of a paper that is both quite detailed and broad in terms of the range of issues that it picks up. I think it's good to hear your overall message is that things are gradually and steadily improving. You mentioned more tailored missions, some of the benefits of the joint geographic teams, the flexibility that we're seeing through the delegation of authority. But of course, some important flags in terms of gaps and limitations around joint planning capacity, the future of CPAS, whether it will become something that is actually bigger than just peacekeeping, but applied to peace operations. And I think this point about, there is a limit to what the UN itself can do, and that ultimately the deployment of these missions is a partnership that relies on member states in so many ways. And I hope this point that you made about where the interests and actions of member states play a critical role is something that we'll come back to, not least because, as I understand it, you mentioned human resources. Much of the progress on human resources relies on agreement, consensus among member states that has proved elusive for so long. Let me then turn to you, Laura, and ask if you could share your reflections on the planning processes, both around the UN verification mission in Colombia, which transitioned from a pre-existing Colombia special political mission, but also the recent handover from MINUJUST under DPO to BNU in Haiti. And I think both of those cases will highlight this issue around continuity in staff and knowledge and relationships that Marc raised. So over to you.
Thanks, Jay. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Congratulations to IPI for organizing this timely discussion, and to Marc Jacquand for an excellent paper that draws out important points on mission planning in times of UN reform, which compounded with the greater context in the 75th anniversary of the UN, the pandemic, diminishing resources financially becomes especially critical. With respect to the two country cases for which I've been asked to comment, Colombia and Haiti, the settings could hardly be more different. Colombia, a middle-income country with strong institutions seeking to implement a peace agreement after the longest armed conflict in Latin America. Haiti, a poor Caribbean state plagued not by a history of armed conflict, but challenged instead to overcome extremely weak institutions lacking in independence and autonomy and prevailing widespread governance dysfunction. The planning challenges were also not comparable. In Colombia, the UN deployed in 2016 and then transitioned in 2017 from one special political mission to another. They were mandated to facilitate different stages of the same peace process. In Haiti in 2019, the UN navigated a far more complex reconfiguration. A light special political mission was deployed to preserve the hard-won gains achieved through a long-standing peacekeeping presence. The transition in Colombia predated the Secretary General's reform. In Haiti, it coincided precisely with their implementation, offering more of a laboratory to gauge their impact. In each case, nonetheless, we can see some of the same important underlying principles that are both inherent to the reforms and highlighted in the study, most notably the importance of flexible design tailored to the needs on the ground and of the moment. The mission in Colombia is a prime example of a tailored mission. In response to a specific request by the government and FARC in the 2016 peace agreement, the mission spent its first year verifying the ceasefire and laying down of arms of FARC. It has spent the following 3 years focusing on two other provisions of a 300-page comprehensive peace accord, namely reintegration of ex-combatants and the implementation of security provisions for former FARC and conflict-affected communities. The IPI study notes correctly that planning choices were limited, given that the bigger decisions on what kind of mission it would be were largely predetermined by host country preferences that were respected by key Security Council members. The Secretary General's planning directive, while on the one hand establishing these overall parameters, defined a planning process that brought the mission and the UNCT together. The planning directive was also helpful in establishing a planning process that was conducted in Bogota under the leadership of the mission, rather than a group dropping in from headquarters. A note on gender mainstreaming. In planning for its core of observers with military and police backgrounds and building on the positive impact of women observers in the first SPM, the second SPM targeted parity in its observer outfit. This was especially important given the high percentage of women in the FARC who laid down arms, roughly a third, and also to increase sensitivity among UN observers on issues such as gender-based violence. Currently, 36% of international observers and 47% of the civilian staff are women. Throughout the life of the mission, from startup through today, the mission and the backstopping offices in New York have benefited from the wealth of experiences and cultures from the different departments. That's applause for the various cultures now coming together. And I would like to second in this context the recommendation of the report encouraging increased staff exchanges. The configuration established in the end in Colombia is, we believe, the right one, a special political mission conducting focused verification alongside a country team with important programmatic responsibilities, one of the largest in the region. The challenges to peace implementation on the ground are still considerable in Colombia. However, it is a peace process that has achieved a great deal, and the UN's role in areas where it can add value continues to be strongly recognized by the government, FARC, and civil society. Turning to Haiti now, the most recent transition of the United Nations configuration in Haiti coincided with the 3 UN reforms that took shape starting in January 2019. As the 15-year-old peacekeeping presence was being downsized and withdrawn to be replaced by a special political mission working hand in hand with 19 UN agencies, funds, and programs, the departments of peacekeeping operations and political affairs were beginning their merger, the DPPA-DPO. The resident coordinator system was being relocated to a newly established development coordination office, reporting directly to the Deputy Secretary General. And all UN transactional administrative tasks were being heralded under the stewardship of the newly expanded Department of Operational Support, DOS. This auspicious coincidence greatly aided the task of mission planning, as the Peacekeeping Haiti desk was seamlessly integrated as a pilot program with the Americas division of the soon-to-be shared regional pillar. Subsequent strategic assessment missions, transition working groups, field workshops, briefings to UN principals and to the Secretary General were jointly executed with colleagues from all of the newly established structures. The SRSG's advocacy with Haiti on its peace building fund eligibility, despite original hesitation by Haitian authorities and the planning process led by PBSO, now part of the greater DPO structure, drawing on national priorities also set by the government, opened the way for UN agencies, funds, and programs to secure bridging funds towards key peace building priorities in this transition. Drawing on expertise at headquarters in the field, the UN presence in Haiti has been able to jointly develop a unified work plan by harnessing an integrated strategic framework as the One UN Plan for Haiti that is able to articulate under 6 benchmarks BNU's Chapter 6 mandate, together with the relevant programmatic work of the UN agencies, funds, and programs. Integrating BNU's political good offices role with the programmatic undertakings of the UN agencies, funds, and programs is still a work in progress. It requires the continued efforts of all UN entities to shift long-standing mindsets focused on their respective mandates, note on the culture, to more open and collaborative concepts of joint planning and implementation. For Haiti, many challenges lie ahead, not the least the current absence of an elected parliament and the presidency's efforts to foster a constitutional reform referendum ahead of the presidential end of the term set for February 2022. We're confident, however, that the UN configuration on the ground is one that is best able to assist Haiti in its ongoing challenges. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. I think both cases highlight and reinforce different points that have been made. But I mean, certainly in the case of Colombia, you mentioned the effort that was taken to mold the mission and shape the mission in line with the expressed desires and priorities of the Colombian government, and in many ways being one of the more tangible examples of this move towards more flexible, more tailored approaches. And similarly in Haiti, you did exactly what I was hoping you would say, which was to highlight this point that Marc had made around the importance of the integrated regional teams and the fact that, as you said, I mean, 15 years of institutional knowledge on Haiti would have resided pre-reform in a separate department, and going through the transition at that moment, you were able to seamlessly bring together and use that institutional knowledge, but with the benefit now as well of PBSO, and I'm glad you raised the role that PBSO had in the planning process in terms of what's the expression that this hinge function between the peace and security architecture and the development system. Interestingly, this point about integrating the agency's funds and programs is one that's very relevant for our next case. So Stephen, let me turn to you. UNITAMS was designed to support the broader Sudanese political transition underway, to look at truly national peace building needs. And as I understand it, it's faced a range of competing expectations in terms of institutional pressures, which Marc alluded to, Security Council interests, and host state priorities. So very interested to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks, Jake, and thanks to the panel, and a special congratulations to Marc for this paper and for some of the thoughtful ideas contained therein. I'm new to this planning team, or this planning group, a very distinguished planning group represented on this panel. So let me also recognize the great experience here and how we've benefited from it in UNITAMS, having consulted widely with those planners and those senior management teams in Haiti, Colombia, and with the HODEDA team, so that we learned a little bit as we were rolling out the planning process. I also, of course, want to thank IPI for convening this and for its continued attention to these more technical issues, which may not be politically sexy, but are very important for how we do our work and how we succeed. I just want to pick up on this, on the several points that are that Marc has raised in his paper and his conclusions about the importance of how the reforms come together. And I want to make the point that we've certainly seen in the Sudan planning team that the reforms are paying off, the peace and security reforms certainly, but also the reforms in some of the other streams, in particular management, where we have the Office of Special Projects, which has been able to help us from the beginning of the planning process to implementation with really tailored support to a startup. And that's really, really been appreciated. At the same time, that office in DOS is also supporting the drawdown of UNIMIT. And it's very timely that we are working together with the same essential people in HQ. So that does really lower the transaction costs, and we're all speaking from the same tune. Also, in terms of the development pillar, Laura certainly made a very strong representation of how it worked in Haiti and Colombia, and we've learned from that, benefited from those knowledge and those experiences. We have also been working very closely with the PBSO, with the Peace Building Fund, which has been a real catalytic element for us in terms of generating interest by the country team to work more closely with us, of course, because some of the funding that might involve, but also as a means to try to trigger a multi-partner trust fund down the road, given limited resources in the assessed budget. We will be relying on XP funds, and we have to do that through an integrated program. So we look forward to continued work with the PBSO, but the support to date has been really, really positive. I'd also like to add that we have consulted on a nearly monthly basis the Economic Commission for Africa. The issues related to the political economy and the economic situation in Sudan are very key to any type of success or imagined success for the mission and for the transitional authorities here. So keeping close in sync with the World Bank, the IMF, the other IFIs, and also the ECA has been particularly useful. And I think the reforms in the development pillar and on the economic side are helping us in this regard to think in a more holistic and coherent way. I also want to pick up on the point related to gender mainstreaming. I'm very proud that from the very beginning, and with the leadership and direction of Rosemary DiCarlo, we have kept the issues of gender and gender mainstreaming front and center. Of course, the revolution in Sudan would not have happened without active role played by women, young women, and of course, young men as well. But we have kept throughout the planning process a very active working group on gender, and ensured that through the mission implementation phase, we are building the necessary capacities in each of the structures of the mission, as well as in the country team, to ensure that women, peace and security, and issues related to conflict-related sexual violence and gender parity as well in terms of our staffing, both national and international, is duly taken into account. Now, in terms of the bringing together the reforms, I wanted to just make the point that a lot of the reforms that are now being implemented and allowing us to work in a more streamlined and coherent way depend on some of the administrative reforms related, for example, to Umoja, and which has led to our ability through delegated authority to allow us a more rolling way of planning, and not necessarily being wedded to one structure, and being stuck to that structure. We will definitely make use of delegated authority once we have an SRSG appointed to adapt and evolve our mission structure to the needs of the government. Another point I would make is the reference to context specificity, consultations and regular consultation with the government and with different actors on the ground, which has really been, again, a hallmark, I think, of this planning process. While we were limited because of COVID-19 from traveling here in the early days, we did have an intense 2-week session on the ground and maintained close interaction with the country team and with different players on the ground throughout the planning process, the 6-month planning process. So we do feel that with that buy-in, when we have landed here now, we have been able to provide a model structure or a structure for the mission that is truly demand-driven and responds to the requests made by the government of Sudan, rather than being something that's templated by departments. I also wanted to pick up on the point of Security Council engagement. While we definitely did this informally with the pen holders and with dedicated sessions with the different council members, including the A3+1, I beg to differ whether a more formal approach would have yielded better results. I think the informal approach was probably sufficient. I look forward to hearing from those attending today what their views are. You know, given some of the differences of view in the council, I'm not sure how this could have played out if we had done a more formal approach, but certainly the regular consultations with the council members has helped us, and we've also done that on the ground, of course, to ensure that we are in line with what the government and with council members are looking for. Finally, the role of clarifying departments. You know, I've noticed that none of us have used up till now the term lead department. Maybe that's a very outdated term. There is a delicate balance to be kept between consultation and making sure that all departments, units and such in headquarters are duly consulted and part of the process and feel included. And then the decision points, because of course the department that's in the lead does need to ultimately project or propose a budget that meets the real budget constraints that we're now facing. And with that, that means choices have to be made. So I think some clarity on the role of consultation and how that is valued, while also recognizing that at some point decisions need to be taken and can't really be revisited time and time again. That needs to all be duly noted. Finally, just to pick up on Marc's point here from his intervention about culture and about mobility that was raised by the Brigadier General, I think this is really fundamental. Marc made the point that the four of us have moved between departments and peacekeeping operations and special political missions. That's really valuable. I don't know how much the organization is valuing this type of cross-departmental, cross-agency fund program mobility. Obviously, the mobility exercise that was started under Ban Ki-moon is now being resuscitated, and that's really important. We hope that that will continue and strengthen shared perspectives. But definitely, let me just leave it with saying that the most important thing is, what are the needs of the country, the needs of the government, and how do you tailor the mission to that? And that should really be the only concern. Thank you. Let me stop there.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And I think a couple of things that I wanted to highlight from what you said. I mean, first off, this need to think in a more holistic and coherent way. And you mentioned the IFIs, the World Bank, as well as the Economic Commission. And I think it reinforces this point. And this is something that David, our next speaker, I know has made repeated reference to, but that peace operations have a specific role, that they are one of a range of tools, and that to achieve the kind of sustainable long-term peace that that I think we're trying to achieve in places like Sudan and Haiti and Colombia requires a concert of actors, and often it is the IFIs and bilateral donors and others, that the country teams as well, that have more of a comparative advantage when we're starting to think about how to address some of the medium and longer term peace building issues that that these countries face, some of the longer term drivers of instability and crisis. You also mentioned this point about the need for regular consultation with council members throughout the process, and I don't know if David will raise it, but I know there's been quite a lot of work that they've been engaged in with both Security Council report and the Stimson Center looking at how to identify priorities and to sequence sequence those priorities, something that the Hippo had raised 5 years ago. So David, with that sort of prelude, let me turn to you. All of the missions that we've spoken about so far are technically special political missions. So it'd be interesting to hear what consequences the reforms have had for DPO, both in terms of existing and future peacekeeping missions, but also the substantive support to other types of field presences that DPO is providing.
Great, thank you, Jake, and thank you very much to IPI and also to all the other speakers for those remarks, which were really, I think, interesting, and I subscribe to pretty much everything that was and has been said. I was thinking to focus a little bit more on the CPAS, since that's the new instrument on the scene and has been mentioned by a few others. But I'll also certainly talk about some of the overall efforts to strengthen planning and some of the points around cross-pillar work, which Jake, you just mentioned. I think, you know, the good news in terms of planning has been laid out. I think there are some real strengths that come out of the reforms, a better understanding about the importances of integration across the pillar, across different pillars. But I would say that I think planning is still something that we struggle to do as well as we should. And Marc's paper highlights a number of these areas, whether they're institutional and political obstacles, gaps between headquarters and the field, or between UN agencies, funds and programs, or at the level of member states themselves. It's something that one continues to need to work on, and certainly in DPO, we've kicked off a new effort to take a look at the planning rules, doctrines and practices which are in place. And some of them are either overlapping or impractical. Some are employed by missions in limited fashion, or conducted as a sort of box checking exercise and or overlap and produce undue burdens on the mission. So we're undertaking an effort to look at how we can streamline and make sure that the various planning instruments that go from the strategic level down to the operational are in good sync. At the same time, I think we also need to think about planning as not just the startup effort, right? A lot of effort goes into planning, and Stephen has described it, and Laura has described it. And then the plan is done, the Security Council accepts the SG's report, the mission is mandated, and then does the plan go on the shelf, or is the plan the baseline against which implementation is then measured? And do we return to the plan continuously? Because the conflict situation is a living situation, and the plan sometimes sits at the starting line, and then the mission just begins to navigate. So I think the question of planning after the startup phase at operational and tactical levels is important. And this is a challenge because very often missions have quite limited planning capacities, and they're not given much by member states in terms of the budgets. And just in the last round of budgets, a number of missions rather, went to the budgetary bodies seeking one more post for planning. And in this budgetary environment, at least, it was not possible to get that. So I think that you'll be surprised when you see very large, even billion-dollar missions having planning units which are 1, 2, 3 people. And that doesn't make a lot of sense either, because however good the plans are at the outset, as I said, the mission will need to continually navigate and plan. So we're going through this review of planning policies. I think also the integration between mission and headquarters, and that's been referenced by Laura and Stephen, I think remains important. And one of the things we want to look at is defining the roles and responsibilities of each. The delegation of authority, which I think was also applied in what Stephen had to say about DOS and its support, I think is important and positive in this regard. It gives missions greater control over their resources, and an ability to adapt to changes in operating environments. And probably we need to do more to fully realize the opportunity that presents to align resources with plans in a dynamic and unfolding way. I think that while there's been a lot that's been said positively about the potential for CPAS, we're still rolling it out. The Comprehensive Planning and Performance Assessment System, CPAS, if those of you who don't know, it's a tool that we've established for peacekeeping operations in which they're asked to develop whole of mission plans to implement their mandates, drawing on the local context, defining where the key drivers of change in the conflict are, where those ones are which the mission can have the most impact, and then really setting a theory of action and impact into a results framework around strategic objectives and not just mandate implementation. So we're not asking what each unit will do in terms of a work plan, we're asking what all the units will do to advance strategic objective A or B, and there shouldn't really be more than 3 or 4 for the entirety of a mission. So the idea is that it's integrative and also that it draws in data and looks at actual impact. So the measurement isn't how many meetings did you have or how many patrols did you run, it's what's the understanding about the level of security that a particular community has. So the measure might be, are the children going back to school, rather than we ran a number of patrols, although the patrols are designed to provide security that then has the impact. As you move down the impact chain, of course, it's harder to prove causality, but ultimately you're getting closer to the key questions of peace and the sustainment of peace. So why is that important? Because very often when we're talking about the integration of plans, one of the challenges with integrating with the country team, for example, is that they have different objectives that come out of their own mandates, their own budget, and their own planning processes than the mission, which has its mandate to wave around, but that doesn't actually drive country team activity. But through the CPAS, if you have a shared objective, for example, to try to establish state authority in a particular region, there's no reason why the country team's plan can't actually have that as the same objective, and that you could begin to see resources align according to the same timelines, looking to see the same impacts across mission and country team, even though they both run distinct planning processes. And I think the shared objectives across partners will also help us to talk in more clear terms with government about what we want to see, host government, and potentially also IFIs, etc. So I think these are some of the key aspects that I wanted to touch on with regard to the CPAS. But lastly, that I think that this sort of approach to planning can help us with transitions, because one of the key lessons from transitions is that the planning should have really been in lockstep from the very beginning with country team, with government and other partners, who then need to pick the baton up as the mission, peacekeeping mission or SPM, is drawing down at the end. And I think that because the planning, if it's asking us to look at the sustainability of work through the conception of the impact we want, then I think this can really be useful at the times of transitions. And you're probably well aware of the Joint Transitions Project that DPO, DPPA, UNDP, and then DCO have been working on, and this is really a key driver for us to work in a cross-pillar way and look down the path using good planning at what the impacts for transition are. Lastly, I'll just say a word. Quite a lot has been said about the improvement in work across the peace and security pillar, and I certainly subscribe to some of that, including the fact that the file doesn't have to change between the old DPA and the old DPKO as you move through transitions. But I would say that there's still work to be done. One of the key questions is the funding streams, and sometimes I think the funding tail wags the planning dog if you're in the peacekeeping budget or in the regular budget. And I think we need to see how to be more inventive with budget options. And I think there's sometimes, therefore, an artificially rigid distinction between what is an SPM and what is a peacekeeping operation. What those things have been vary as widely inside the category as they do between the category. And so sometimes these are differences without really distinction. And I think we need to try to sort of maintain that focus that Hippo had on the concept of peace operations and a spectrum of tools that can be applied flexibly within. I think I've probably gone over time, so I'll stop there, but happy to take more in questions. Thank you.
Thanks, David. That's actually an excellent segue to our last speaker. Before I turn to Ian, I did want to say the Q&A function, we've got a couple questions that have come in for those of you who are watching sort of in the room. If you have a question or a comment that you want to put to our speakers, you can drop it in the Q&A function, and we'll turn to those in a little bit. David, maybe just to pick up a few points you raised before I turn to Ian. I mean, this with CPAS, this point that planning needs to be a continuous adaptive process, both at the strategic and the operational level, that's continually being revisited. But I also, the point you made about strategic planning capacity and the fact that in many ways, what we're seeing is a disconnect between, on one hand, the desire by member states, including the Council, for more realistic, more adaptive planning. And yet when it comes down to a willingness to support those capacities in mission, we're seeing a paucity of civilian police and military planners, as well as platforms that bring them together with the country team. And I think this idea of identifying shared objectives is an interesting one that's worth further attention. And your final point on funding streams and the spectrum between peacekeeping and peace operations, I know is one that's very dear to our next speaker's heart. So I'm going to turn to you, Ian. And maybe by way of introducing what you're about to say, I mean, the HIPAA was very clear about what it saw as the dysfunction of the previous departmental arrangements for peace operations. And I wanted to read one line from the HIPAA report, which was, it said that the current headquarters configuration is hampering the effective assessment, design, and conduct of UN peace operations, and more generally, the Secretariat's work in support of international peace and security. So I guess the big question I have for you is, have the recent reforms addressed these challenges? Over to you.
Thanks, Jake, and congratulations to IPI for having the very good sense to commission Marc to do this, and appreciation to Marc on a really excellent paper. I've struggled to find something to disagree with. I might just about manage to find something at the end of what I say. Indulge me if I start with a personal anecdote. An academic friend of mine has access to Kofi Annan's papers, and he recently told me that he came across a memo war from early 2000 between the Undersecretaries General of DPA and DPKO, Kieran Prendergast for DPA, Bernard Millet for DPKO, in which each of them cited my end of mission report from East Timor against the other. I was naturally very excited by this, not least because it's my first indication that any end of mission report of mine was actually noticed at such elevated levels of the Secretariat. So I dug it out of my East Timor boxes. And I'm pleased to say that I found that indeed it was extremely even-handed in its criticism of both departments, and both in aspects that related to planning. Because while DPA had developed an expertise on East Timor that I deeply, deeply respected and drew on, it was reluctant and slow to involve DPKO in the planning of a mission that had a major police component, as well as some military liaison officers. And then I criticized DPKO when it became the lead department for not drawing properly on the hugely accumulated expertise, country expertise that existed in DPA. Well, that began what some of you might think was an obsession of mine with the dysfunction of the Secretariat, all the way through to being able to contribute to what Hippo said and recommended on the subject. And I believe Hippo did influence the Secretary General's reforms. So as an advocate of reform, I find this discussion extremely encouraging. All the positive aspects of what Marc says in his paper, your other panelists know a lot that I don't know about what's actually developed since in the system. And I've listened today, and of course I've read the Secretary General's own review. So that's great, but I'd like to suggest that what we're spelling out as positive developments are largely an argument for going further. I haven't heard actually anybody say that there have been major negative consequences of any of the changes that we're looking at, but several aspects that Marc highlights as to how they might go further. And of course, the centerpiece for me has always been the need to get away from two regional divisions and arrive at a context where the Secretariat's political expertise is applied continuously at all stages of the UN's engagement with a country, and where the focus on a particular country, because it has a mission, isn't separated out from the regional understanding of the context surrounding it. And those are huge gains potentially, so long as mini DPAs and DPKOs aren't allowed to continue to exist within the structure. But indeed, as I'm grateful for David for anticipating me and you, Jake, my biggest disappointment in terms of where Hippo has taken things is the fact that Hippo's emphasis on getting away from the bifurcation of PKOs and SPMs and thinking in terms of a spectrum of peace operations in which you draw on different elements at different stages of the process on the ground, that hasn't really been adopted. And there are times when the Secretariat and the Secretary General still talks in terms of peace operations, but also resistance to talking in terms of peace operations. I think that's really a mistake, and I think it's important to go on saying that bifurcation in managerial arrangements and in funding arrangements, very importantly, makes no sense and makes less and less sense in a world in which it's now 2014 that there was last a new peacekeeping operation planned, and as has already been said, all the recent peace operations happen to have been SPMs, although, you know, like the mission I headed in Nepal, SPMs whose core function has actually been a military monitoring function, which is clearly true of Hodeidah and a significant element of Colombia also. So really, that's got to be re-examined, and I hope that the Secretary General will spell out to member states, as Ban Ki-moon did, the dysfunction that comes from the funding arrangements in particular. Now, that's largely a member state problem, of course, but some of the resistances to further improving the managerial arrangements have been resistances in the Secretariat itself. So the focus today being on planning, I guess the thing that in the near future could most readily be done is among Marc's recommendations, is a single planning and review process, whether a mission is or is going to be a PKO or an SPM. When the Executive Committee decided on the strategic review process, again, in my opinion, it made no sense at all that it only discussed that in the context of peacekeeping operations, although there are already significant strategic reviews commissioned for political missions. So 6 quick points as to what I think is crucial to mission planning. Some already emphasized, some perhaps not. One, that it should be a whole of system process, but a whole of system process, not just in terms of the representation of everybody, but different bits of the system knowing what they actually understand and know and can contribute to that process, which is not always the same thing. And to promote that, to begin by focusing on a common strategic understanding, not on the immediate arbitrage as to who does what, which was the characteristic of those old technical assessment missions of which I had too many experiences. Next, involve real country expertise from outside the Secretariat too. I don't think we've gone very far with that. And of course, Haiti, Colombia, Sudan were contexts where the system had a great deal of expertise of its own, which wasn't true, for example, of Libya when we looked at planning Libya. But the contribution that was made in the Libya planning process by just one genuine external expert available as a consultant of the process was enormous. Next, draw on the relevant experience from all peace operations. Again, Mark said it and David said it. There are not two different kinds of missions called PKOs and SPMs. Most of the characteristics they have in common, except for the obvious military characteristics in the, well, and as I've said, even those spill over into SPMs. So, in my opinion, not only should the planning function be a common function in the peace and security pillar, but policy and guidance should be a shared service as well. I mean, especially as it relates to missions. Next, mission planning should be at least a two-stage process as far as possible. And some of you will recall the Hippo recommendation for two-stage planning, again, hasn't come to the point of seeing how far that would be done in a new peacekeeping operation. But the need to recognize that only when you get on the ground do you fully see what you really need and engage with the host government, with civil society, you then need flexibility. And of course, unfortunately, the budgetary process is a massive, massive obstacle to that. And one needs to try to look further at how that flexibility can be enhanced. And finally, planning should involve as much as possible the future leadership of a mission. I was fortunate to be on the ground in Nepal, on the ground briefly in Libya, or involved in Libya before, during the planning phase, before I became the SRSG for the mission. Maybe one couldn't even in ideal circumstances always do that with the SRSG, but at least with key people who are going to be part of the mission leadership. And that, of course, is the opposite of the long hiatus that we've seen in Sudan. And that is itself a huge dysfunction that needs to be taken on board by the Secretary General and faced up to by those members of the Security Council who are making mission leadership appointments more and more impossible. So I said I looked hard for a point of disagreement with Mark. I think he's a little too ready to accept as inevitable the imposition of the views of members of the Security Council. And I think this whole question of the involvement of the Security Council, which has already been referred to a number of times, deserves unpicking a bit and further discussion. Mark refers to it as reflecting the authority of the council. To be honest, it often reflects the imposition of one member of the council so as to prevent the full council from having available to it the views to make a council decision, and becomes an extension of the penholder dominance of decisions in the council. I certainly think full strategic reviews should go to the council, whether or not the Secretariat agrees with them. The Secretary General will always spell out his own views. But I think we also need to remind ourselves of the famous Brahimi saying that the responsibility of the Secretariat is to tell the Security Council what it needs to know, not necessarily what it wants to hear. And that applies to the US in Haiti and France in Mali as much as it applies in any other context. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. It's, I think, really fantastic to have both the comparison of where we were 5 years ago and some of the issues that the Hippo was grappling with, and looking at how far we've come and where we still need to make changes. And I think you've laid out an ambitious wish list for both the Secretariat and member states that want to continue to push on this agenda. We've got about 20 minutes for some questions and discussions. There's a number that have come in. one of the themes that has come up in a couple of the questions, actually, and it refers back to something that I think both Laura, you mentioned, and Stephen, that you mentioned in the case of Colombia and Sudan, which is the role of the host government in shaping, helping to shape the ultimate configuration of the mission on the ground. And two slightly different questions, but essentially getting at what the role for civil society is, or where there are opportunities for civil society to engage in the planning process and to look at how their views are actually being incorporated in those processes. So maybe that's one we can start off with. There was another question about the role of the Peace Building Support Office and the integration of PBSO into DPPA. And this, I guess, Stephen, it was you that mentioned their role in leading the mission planning process. So the question is, as we look at recent mission planning processes and the integration of PBSO, given the fact that it is quite a light team that PBSO has, what has their involvement actually meant in practice? What does it look like in practice? And then maybe just to take one final question, a point that many of you have touched on is the role of member states, and the fact that there's only so much that the Secretariat itself can do in terms of achieving the aims of the reforms, in terms of analytic capacity, in terms of strategy, in terms of planning, and addressing the remaining divisions and gaps, precisely that wish list that you, Ian, have just laid out, and the recommendations that Mark makes in the paper. So the question is, in your view, what should member states focus on? What should the Secretariat focus on internally, and where do they need to work together? So maybe we could come back to all of you. We probably have just enough time for everyone to give a quick response to any of those questions. Don't feel obligated to respond to all of them, but why don't we go in reverse order? So Ian, if I could start with you.
I can't speak to the PBSO in practice. Let me say a bit about civil society engagement, because I think it really goes back to planning not being a single stage process. I'm all for doing whatever one can do at the planning stage to hear civil society voices, but I think it's extremely limited compared to what can happen once one's on the ground in country, and the continuous responsibility of a mission to engage with civil society. Because only then do you really begin to get a sense of what civil society voices speak for whom, with what degree of objectivity or interest. So to me, it goes much more to the continuous engagement of a mission and mission planning team once it's on the ground, rather than a great deal that can be done up front in the first mission planning process. So let me just leave it at that and pass the other questions to others.
Thanks, Ian. David, let me turn to you.
Thanks, Jake. In terms of what the Secretariat should focus on, I think we should continue to focus on ensuring that the pillar works quite seamlessly. And you asked me this question, Jake, which I didn't answer the first time. But I think that the basic concept should be that wherever there is a center of expertise in the pillar, peace and security pillar, or indeed across the UN, that center of expertise should serve across the various boundaries of types of operation. And we're seeing that increasingly. So our police, for example, in the rule of law or ROLC, are working in non-mission settings. And this isn't a new thing. Going back to the Timor days that that Ian was talking about, the Election Assistance Division was understood to be something that worked across the system, and sometimes there are bureaucratic tussles about that, but basically because it's a center of expertise, it should work that way. And I feel that very strongly about all of the different parts of the pillar, and there shouldn't be any sensitivity to purportedly reaching across some line which is an SPM or a PKO line. I think that's very much old thinking, and I think we need to get beyond it, and it still exists somehow as an institutional muscle memory that we need to be careful of. So I think that's one thing we need to focus on in terms of Secretariat at headquarters. But in terms of overall planning, I think it's about strengthening planning capacities, making sure that there is a good planning capacity in terms of people and training, and then making sure that our planning systems, tools, policies are well streamlined. And to the extent possible, strengthening our missions, because we're not, again, talking about the initial plan. We're talking about an ongoing planning, performance, assessment of performance, revision of planning cycle, which is really what you want to you want to see. And some of those things are being done in this working group, which I mentioned that I'm involved in as well. And then I also just see in the question and answers, there's a quick question from Gay Rosenblum. Kumar, I'm sure Stephen might want to address it too, but protection of civilians and unarmed methods. And I just want to say that while certainly the blue helmet and the patrol are emblematic of peacekeeping operations, the approach which we take to protection, the 3 tiers, include as much emphasis or more on political aspects, on creating institutional support for protection, supporting local communities, engaging in community reconciliation, etc. And so I think civilian aspects are critical. So I would agree with Gay Rosenblum Kumar, but just to say that I don't actually think that there is a military only focus in our protection model. And indeed, when Stephen was planning UNITAMS, we worked hard to try to think about protection options that could continue the protective impact that UNIMIT has had into the successor mission, because this was an important concern voiced by the IDPs themselves to speak to the question of input from local communities. Thank you.
Thanks, David. That's a good segue to you, Stephen.
Yes, let me try to pick up on each of these briefly. I mean, on protection of civilians and civil society engagement, from the time that Fink Haysom, the special advisor of the Secretary General, came out just post-revolution, there have been consultations going on with civil society on the ground, and of course, more international civil society actors. I would completely agree with what Ian has said about also leaving enough space for our arrival on the ground and do consultation with the Sudan-based local civil society actors to ensure that their voices are heard. But I also make the point that the country team partners that we've been engaging with from the beginning, and that also the special advisor had been engaging in, whether it's UNICEF, UNDP, UN Women, UNFPA, they also have extensive civil society networks, and we have to rely on them to a certain extent to bring some of those voices and thinking into the planning process. But that engagement with civil society in the Sudan context will certainly continue now in implementation, including through some type of sounding board or some type of informal or formal sounding board with civil society. So that's certainly a key aspect given the civil society's role throughout the revolution in the last few months and years of Sudan's development. With regards to civilian protection, as David has referred, we've spent a quarter of the planning exercise. One of the clusters was very much focused on civilian protection, what it meant in a post-UNIMID framework where there was no military, no formed units, and no police, no formed police units at least. So definitely the concept really relies on networks with civil society actors across the post-conflict areas, not only Darfur, but of course the 2 areas and even Eastern Sudan now will also be very important. And so that concept now, to get it to fruition, will take a real intense effort at hiring the right people who are certainly committed to working across different protection disciplines, so that we don't have a siloization of our protection effort, and that we really have an integrated effort at civilian protection, child protection, women's protection, conflict-related sexual violence, and similarly that we have a shared concept and approach towards data collection, data analysis, and then advocacy based on that data. So all of this is part of what we now have planned, have put in the concept for the mission, and now need to try to implement by recruiting really multifunctional people with a range of experience. So that will be a real challenge. The role of PBSO, I just want to touch on very quickly. They really did step up in the planning process for UNITAMs, and their continued involvement and their continued engagement going forward will be a key part of making sure that the country team also stays engaged. Now, they are very tightly resourced, and their approach is really through using agencies, funds, and programs on the ground. So we have built in resources for peace building planning in our mission in the office of the DSRSG to help to continue with all of UN approach towards peace building activities, which will then rely on entities, agencies, funds, and programs as implementing partners. We hope that model will work. We'll see. We may need to also outplace more people into the actual agencies, funds, and programs, depending. But of course, those programs would involve staff, expert staff for the different implementing partners. On the role of member states, I would just say that it's a pretty clear divide to me. The member states need to be at the strategic level, of course, looking at the resolution and looking at the benchmarks and addressing the benchmarks, coming up with difficult decisions on prioritization. In the case of 25-24 for UNITAMs, there's 4 very large comprehensive areas which we couldn't do completely by any stretch of the imagination in year 1. So some help from member states and helping us to prioritize would be appreciated. Where we feel, of course, there's less value is in micromanagement and in sort of looking at different functions. I think they need to hold the Secretariat accountable to the main strategic goals and assess us in that way. Let me stop there.
Thanks, Stephen. Laura, please.
On national ownership, the Colombian peace process was very much of a nationally owned process, with international actors invited to provide specific support. With respect to a mission, the Colombian parties, which were not just host government, but parties to the peace agreement, right? And in this case, had a very clear idea of what they wanted, what they didn't want, and it is important that the UN was able to tailor that response. And in a country with considerable national capacities, including in its security forces, a strong sense of sovereignty, large pre-existing UN presence in the country team, a multidimensional peacekeeping operation was clearly not going to be the right instrument, nor was there appetite in the host country or most of the UNCT for integration under a Security Council mandate of the entire UN system, which had and continues to have a long-standing development, humanitarian, and human rights presence in the country. The ceasefire, the laying down of arms stage overseen by the first mission, was completed with speed, little difficulty. The kinds of security and civilian protection challenges facing Colombia today cannot be addressed by a UN mission. Our role is the appropriate and the realistic one of verifying the national commitments on the security guarantees. On protection of civilians, in line with what David was saying, the Colombian mission, while not itself having responsibilities to provide protection, has a very strong focus on advocating for the full implementation of provisions in the peace agreement on security guarantees that involve state responsibility to protect vulnerable communities and individuals. It is a recurring theme in the SG reports, and the mission is present in many forums where advocacy for protection is fundamental. On civil society, I would agree with Ian. During the planning process, which was led on the ground by the mission, the country team, they have been very closely attentive to civil society views, and in the implementation, it's an ongoing process. The peace agreement itself is advanced in reflecting much input from civil society, And they are definitely in Colombia one of the strong voices that appreciates the mission role. And women's groups, incidentally, are particularly relevant in this context of the greater civil society consultation. Just briefly on Steve's earlier point on informal versus formal council consultations. In Colombia, there were both formal and informal processes. The council requested reports from the SG on the request of the Colombians for the mandate. But there was also important informal communication, especially with the pen holder. And in Colombia, the case of the Colombia mission has not been plagued, let's say, by differences among council members. It's one of the ones where we are proud of the ongoing consensus, which is a very increasingly difficult but very delicate act to maintain. They are always united in their support and the trust, in the UN and our actions there. And then finally, in response to David's comment of what happens to the plan when the startup is done, in Haiti, the planning to establish the new UN configuration developed benchmarks with indicators that the Security Council tracks through the benchmark annex to the SG report, which comes out every 120 days. And this comprehensively provides that level of monitoring as the CPAS has been providing in peacekeeping operations, but we look forward to speaking on the potential merger of these planning and monitoring tools as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. Mark, back to you.
Thanks. Very, very briefly. I thank the other panelists for bringing up the budget issue. It's in the paper, but I should have mentioned it. To me, it's really on the member states. And this is really holding back the planning, the quality of the plans and the quality of the planning outcomes. It is something that needs to be fixed because too often there's even self-censorship in the planning to accommodate the easiest budget, solution. So I think this is a conversation that needs to continue. On civil society, absolutely, but it's a recurring theme. We need to consult. The question, there are risks involved in consulting, and it also requires a specific skill set. One doesn't just parachute someone in a context and consult with civil society. It requires analysis. It requires a number of skills. So I think we need to, obviously I'm not disagreeing, but I think we need to go beyond the recommendation to consult with civil society. I think we need to do a lot better, and we need to be a lot better at it. The role of PBSO, maybe another element, I think Stephen mentioned it in the case of Sudan, is PBSO also manages the relationship with the World Bank and IMF. And that's critical, bringing that into mission planning. And we've seen it in Haiti as well. We've seen it in Sudan. And that really is something that is an extremely important element of the mission planning. And that leads me to my fourth point about the role of member states. I think I agree with the distinction that Stephen made. Another recommendation we need for member states to really align their engagement at the council with their engagement on the boards of the IMF and the World Bank, their military diplomacy. I think some member states do it more systematically than others, but we see it in Sudan. I saw it in Somalia, that what the IMF does, what the World Bank does in Somalia, when it's aligned with the political strategy of the UN, it really helps a country. And so perhaps another thing to think about as we, beyond this particular discussion, is that the alignment it's starting to happen. And I also think that it's remarkable to see what's happening with the IMF, the bank. There's been a good partnership, but the IMF is really now much more engaged on peace and security issues. And that's really important. And that can only be sustained also through member states' engagement in the board of the IMF. Finally, I'll leave you on that note, the SPN PKO divide. I fully agree, obviously, with Ian. I think there are differences. Obviously, budget is one, but there are differences in culture and tools. But these are differences that we choose to perpetuate or not. And I actually think people on the fellow panelists have worked in both and on both SPMs and PKOs, and to very little damage, I think, to their personal identities. So I agree that this is something that we need to overcome, because in practice in the field, there's very little distinction. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. I want to thank all of our panelists, and a special thanks to you, Marc, for the paper. And again, a thanks to you, Roland, and to the French Ministry of the Armed Forces for its support of this research. Take care, and thank you very much.